elections or even in an election manifesto, it would be included that, okay, the Assam Accord should be implemented. So it was just, in a sense, a tokenism, I would say, but it didn't really sort of tear Assam apart in terms of what's happening now, and it's deeply scary for people who do not know who do not know what the future holds for them.
Thanks, Arijit. As Leah and Arijit have spoken about what is happening on the ground, this with the reality of the NRC and how the Foreigners Tribunal is playing, the issue is playing out, I thought this now be a good time to jump into the discussions of constitutionality and the role of the court in this process with Harish's remarks.
Thanks, Alok, and thanks, Leah and Arijit, for your comments. So, I think the before I come to the 2 points that you mentioned, Alok, I want all of us to remember the global context in which we are living, where immigration, migration, refugees, aliens, these are all extremely political and sensitive words, right? Now, there is at the same time, it's caused because of the insistence on free flow of capital, right? I mean, if you look at it, there are two things that we need to remember, right? There's a free flow of capital, which more and more people are insisting, although, Trump seems to think otherwise, and Brexit also indicates otherwise. But I don't think they are necessarily a game-changing event or events in terms of the free flow of capital. Okay, the last 200 years is all about free flow of capital, right? Now, as an idea, if you look at free flow of capital, then what is the big problem with free flow of people, correct? And that is something, we will struggle with, and we have been struggling with. So all and every country will go through this. We have a different problem. I mean, what the problem that Leah and Arijit talked about is different problem. It's not necessarily linked to free flow of capital and movement of people. But if you look at what's happening in the US and what's happening in Europe, it's people moving for a better life, right? Purely for economic reasons, may not be for other reasons. Yes, there are other examples. I'm not trying to simplify it. I'm just trying to contextualize that there is this free flow of capital and free flow of people. And free flow of people is something that countries don't like. They want to regulate how people move. But at the same time, the countries who protest free flow of people are the ones who push for free flow of capital, right? And that is something we should not forget, because ultimately something has to give in terms in this tension between free flow of capital and free flow of people, because the most successful technological and economically developed countries have benefited not only from the free flow of capital but also from the free flow of people, right? I mean, if you see the reasons for the continuous stream of technological innovations that come out from the US and earlier in Europe, was partly because of free immigration, right? I mean, the people moved, and the best people move to the best of countries in terms of opportunities, and it's caused, I'm not making a value judgment on which country is best or not. I'm just pointing out that this is something that we should not forget. So, and then you come down to where we are. Our problem, and what the earlier speakers talked about, is linked to what happened in 1947. Is largely linked to what happened in 1947, and prior to that, in terms of how the partition took place and all of that. And then in 1971. I'll come to the NRC itself and the court's involvement later. But and I must admit, I'd read about the Citizenship Amendment Bill, reports about it and summaries that friends had sent, but I actually only read the amendment 3 days ago. And I'm still recovering from that reading. And I'm not talking about this as a lawyer. I'm talking about this being an Indian. And Alok talked about what the Constituent Assembly debated and what our tallest leader spoke about in the, literally the tallest leader that we have. Spoke about in the Constituent Assembly, and how the world is looking at us, and today the world is looking at him as the tallest leader. But, jokes apart, I think the thought process behind the amendment repudiates everything that India is about, right? It repudiates the founding of India. And not, I don't know what will happen, with this amendment, whether the court will uphold it, not uphold it. I'm not on that. But I talk about this, the person who introduced me talked about my book, which came out recently. And one of the things that I talk about is the Constitution is just a simple document that followed, or that reflects the revolution that we wanted India to be, right? And the idea that we are going to give citizenship to certain communities of certain countries, right? And though all three countries are linked to 1947. Not so much Afghanistan, but certainly Pakistan and Bangladesh. Many people would consider that, still culturally part of India. So it repudiates, to me, it repudiates, what India stands for, right? And our choice that we don't want to be a religious-based society. So that is a problem with the bill. Yes, it has a lot of other, sort of legal issues, which, I'm sure we can discuss in the question and answer session. But I think as in 1950, what we did, apart from making certain rules about how our state should function, we also adopted many things, right? We adopted, as Alok said, we were fairly liberal in how we treat ourselves. And when I say how we treat ourselves, who got the right to vote? People thought we were foolish when we gave the right to vote to everyone, every adult. We gave the right to vote to every adult. People thought we were foolish, we wouldn't survive. People thought only landed gentry or certain castes should get the right to vote. All these things were kicked out of the nearest window. We didn't accept it. The Constituent Assembly didn't accept it. It could not have accepted it because of how the freedom movement had developed. And the express rejection that India would be a religious or a religion-dominated country when it comes to citizenship is very clear. How much ever retrospective whitewashing or color washing we want to do from today based on who is in power, who is not in power, it won't fly, because the record is, for once, I think we moved away from not keeping documentation of all significant things that happen in a country. And thankfully, the Constituent Assembly debates are recorded very well. So some of these ideas were kicked out. And it is part of our DNA, whether we may agree with some of it, we may not agree with some of it, but it is part of our DNA. So if certain ideas are now being brought up to challenge the ideas accepted in the Constitution Assembly, then there is a bit. And again, I don't want to say that no new ideas can come up. I mean, certainly there should be questions about policies and choices constantly. I mean, I'm not saying that we should not question certain decisions that were made hundreds of years ago. I mean, that's quite foolish. But there are certain elements that define us. The respect to an individual, irrespective of his religion or caste, is something that we cannot debate about. And this amendment bill, while it talks, I mean, it tries to identify it in the context of people who are not Indians, right? I mean, they are citizens of another country, and we should, that is the reason why it may not have made so much of news in the in states other than the states that are directly affected. Because I mean, in Bangalore, I don't think we face direct immigration from foreign countries, right? So I don't think people are aware of it that much. But
Bangalore is also catching up with what they're doing with people who work and being suspected as Bangladeshis.
see that, yeah, I mean, we can talk about that. But see, but also I think the problem also is it's actually laying down a challenge to other countries. And that is the problem. What you're essentially saying is citizenship in our country is defined primarily by your identity in another country, an identity based on religion. And I think I have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with saying who you want to accept, who you don't want to accept. And that, yes, we may debate whether some of those choices that the government makes is constitutional or not. But this particular amendment bill, it is trying to challenge what other countries define their citizens as, right? And that is a problem. Now, so I'll discuss some of the other problems I have with the amendment bill when we come to discussing the specifics of that bill. The second point in relation to the amendment bill is the lack of moral and political leadership that this bill shows. One of the things that India was defined in the post-independent period was the moral and political leadership it showed towards the world, right? It showed to the rest of the colonized countries who had just become independent, and they looked up to India for moral and political leadership in terms of how to treat citizens and in terms of how to deal with the world. And this bill is a step back from that moral and political leadership. We have lost a moral and political leadership a while ago, but I think, but that may not have been of our own doing, because of our increasing irrelevance in certain contexts. But I think this is a self-goal if there was one in terms of moral and political leadership. Now, coming to the courts. How much time do I have on this?
If I can, about 4 or 5 minutes.
4 or 5 minutes. Unfortunately, in two simple words, the court shouldn't be doing this. The Supreme Court has no business trying to monitor how the NRC should be set up. Unfortunately, there was a reason. Nothing much happened. Many accords were signed. There was lack of implementation, and the court thought that they were doing a great thing by, the bench of Justice Gogoi and Nariman thought they were doing an innovative thing by asking for, the preparation of the draft NRC. Now, this is part of a wider problem of what courts in India are doing. They're basically doing things they shouldn't be doing. Right? It is not their job to make policy or to oversee implementation of administrative actions or political actions. Now, if I have a problem with how the NRC has been, how the draft has been made, and many problems have been identified by the previous speakers, where will I go to challenge it? Will I go to the Supreme Court and say, it is wrong? This court has essentially narrowed down the reasons for challenging this entire process. Yes, there is one case, the famous Antole case, where they said even courts cannot violate fundamental rights through their judgments. But it is not something, I don't think courts will look kindly when you tell them that a previous bench of the Supreme Court was not correct in ordering something. That is why courts have to stay within the four boundaries, the four corners of their own jurisdiction. Judges have no capacity or knowledge to deal with issues of policy making. Right? See, a policy, and we should not forget this, a policy at the core of it is essentially an arbitrary choice. Any policy is an arbitrary choice, but an arbitrary choice backed by certain reasoning, which is political, moral, and depending on the nature of the policy, other factors that come in. A judgment has to be reasoned. It has to be based on the law and the Constitution. A judgment cannot have overtones of moral and political issues. Yes, and I'm using broad brush strokes here. I mean, there are more nuances there, but essentially, because then it becomes, to keep the argument simple, it becomes the moral and political overtones of the individual judges, and that is what judiciary as an institution avoids. The last point I want to make on this judicial thing is they're actually violating the concept of judicial independence themselves. And this is it's a subtle point, but I want you all to think about it and appreciate it. Judicial independence is not only non-interference by the other organs of government. It is also what the judiciary does with the other organs of the government. You can only exercise your independence within your house. You cannot, in the name of independence, exercise certain rights of other organizations. Once you do that, you lose your independence. You can be open to questioning on the same basis that the other institutions are questioned. Something like the NRC can be questioned politically, can be questioned through agitations, if it was done by the executive or the legislature alone. But if it is done by the judiciary, or if it's done pursuant to an order of the judiciary, then it becomes difficult to agitate politically or legislatively on these issues. I only have one more point to make, not on the courts, but about the migration and what they were talking about. See, and I know we talked about Bangalore and Assam, but practically, there's nothing local about migration. Okay, and I know, one of my colleagues in the previous session asked about integration, and as if it was a local issue, but migration is never a local issue. There's always, it's either regional in terms of political issues, there could be military issues. The previous session, they were talking about the Rohingya. What are India and the US doing in terms of, telling the government of Myanmar about this issue? So it is never a local issue as in a border issue. There's also a regional, political, and a cultural issue. And we should not forget this. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Harish. Sure. Round of applause. I'm going to say no. So, on the basis of those initial remarks, I thought we could distill about 3 or 4 points which sort of came through in the thing, in what has been mentioned so far, and sort of move this discussion forward. One thing that sort of occurred to me, and sort of want to round out the point that which you brought up, is that it's at least since we're talking about cross-border migration,